Good afternoon. I'm Luiza Savage. I'm an executive director with POLITICO, and we are very pleased to be here in our second year of a media partnership with the Halifax Security Forum, particularly as we grow POLITICO into a global policy and politics news organization, and especially since this year we are building out POLITICO Canada on top of POLITICO and POLITICO Europe. So it's a special day for us, and thank you to Peter and the forum for having us here. Our panel is called The Arctic End of the Earth, which I guess makes sense if you think there's an end on a sphere. But I think we would all agree that the Arctic is really more the center stage right now for some of the key trends that are shaping the world, and those include climate change, of course, and the rise of great power competition, the rise of China and its ambitions. So those are the topics that I'm hoping we will dive into today and see how democracies are or aren't positioning themselves to this changing situation. And we know the Arctic is also obviously a big strategic and military importance due to its location going back to the Cold War. So with us, we have a great panel that will represent various stakeholders in the Arctic. We have, of course, Secretary of the Navy, Richard Spencer. Thank you for being with us. We have General Terrence O'Shaughnessy, who is both commander of NORAD and of U.S. Northern Command, and that is particularly significant because he is charged with being the advocate for the Arctic within the entire U.S. military and articulating the capabilities that the Arctic requires. And we also have Major General Tammy Harris, who's a former deputy commander of the Royal Canadian Air Force, and we have Mr. Espen Barth Eide, who is a member of the Norwegian Parliament and a former defense minister and also former foreign minister. So thank you for being with us. And I'd like to start our conversation talking about the big picture on the Arctic. But before I do, I just wanted to give the Secretary the opportunity to respond to the breaking news that a lot of people in this room are buzzing about right now, and that is the New York Times story that just broke. Can you confirm, or do you want to comment on this story that you were threatening to resign from your post if the Navy is not allowed to sort out its own process around the Navy SEAL who the President would like to promote?
The Arctic is a very important place. Contrary to popular belief, I'm still here. I did not threaten to resign. But let us just say that we're here to talk about external threats, and Eddie Gallagher is not one of them.
All right, is everyone satisfied with that answer? I'm just here as your proxy. All right. Well, so back to the Arctic. So the backdrop is such that China has said it wants to build the Polar Silk Road over the Arctic to cut weeks off of shipping times to the Western Hemisphere. Russia has articulated an Arctic strategy, which has been described to me by Sherry Goodman, a former U.S. Deputy Defense Secretary, as an attempt to build a Russian toll road that requires Russian icebreakers to escort ships that will want to use those seaways. And it has been investing in icebreakers and nuclear icebreakers. President Putin has talked about it in terms of competitiveness and also prestige. So I wanted to ask you, Secretary, first, how do you see America's evolving strategy, the big picture on the Arctic?
It was very interesting. My first international trip after being sworn in was to Reykjavik to the Arctic convivium that we had up there, the council. And to be very frank with you, I was not that knowledgeable on what was going on in the Arctic. I'd had just the superficial briefs, and having spent 2 days up there at the conference, my eyes were peeled back as to what was really going on up there. We heard about the activities then of Russia putting 10,000 Spetsnaz troops up there, repaving 6 Cold War airstrips, all for, as the ambassador from Russia said, search and rescue. It was a great concern to me. We went back and we dusted off what was then called the Navy's roadmap to the Arctic and really focused it to be a strategy that, or a sub-strategy that undergirded the national defense strategy. It is one of our key focus areas. I mean, General O'Shaughnessy has this square in his lap, but Navy is there as one of the supporting teams for the U.S. approach to how we keep order, peace, and resiliency up there going forward.
Mm-hmm. So in terms of the place that the Arctic occupies in U.S. strategic planning right now? Is it rising up the ranks? Is it becoming a more important issue as the waters melt and as these countries take more aggressive steps in the Arctic?
I would certainly say it is, and part of the reason is, I think, as we look at all the activity we see in the Arctic, and some of that was mentioned in the Secretary's speech, and earlier today we talked about the rules-based international order all over the globe and how important that is, equally as important within the Arctic. But from our perspective as well is the defense of our nations, and I represent both NORAD and NORTHCOM. On the NORAD side, the defense of both the U.S. and Canada, and then on the NORTHCOM side, the defense of the United States. We find that this is actually key terrain. And this is really almost going back in time. And we've, over the last several decades, maybe spent less interest from the military standpoint in the Arctic. But now as we see Russia activities, we see Chinese activities, and we see potential threats coming through the Arctic, this becomes increasingly more important to us within both the NORAD side and the NORTHCOM side. And so we do see an increasing emphasis on it, increasing priority on it, and of course with Homeland Defense, Continental Defense being our top priority, the Arctic has become front and center to some of our conversations.
Mm-hmm. And I want to talk about the specific threats in a few minutes, but just staying on this broader vision, if Russia's looking at this and saying there's a lot of money to be made in the Arctic, there's oil and gas, there's drilling, and China saying fish stocks are moving north and we want access to that protein, is the U.S. looking at the Arctic merely as a theater for defensive operations, or do we have other strategic and economic interests in there? How do you see it in the broad sense?
Yeah, if you're the specific question to the U.S. side, is we have our own resources up there as well, and so it becomes important for us as a nation to make sure we secure them, make sure we maintain access to them. And then from the global perspective, again, it's the rules-based international order that has served so well across the globe, applies equally as well to the Arctic. And so whether we talk about some of the things the Russians are doing and they're demanding that aren't necessarily in accordance with the normal rules that we would expect to see, we see China and other places doing coercive economics, other things. We want to make sure that doesn't apply in the Arctic. So we look at it both from the U.S. perspective of our own natural resource up there and make sure we protect them, but also from the global perspective as well.
Mm-hmm. And Major General Harris, from the Canadian perspective, there are Canadians who see the Arctic as not their backyard, but their front yard. Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit about today, what is Canada's strategy and policy around the Arctic?
Sure. For those who don't know, actually, the Arctic is 40% of our landmass, 75% of our coastline, so we have 200,000 inhabitants up there. A rich indigenous culture that we want to preserve, and a lot of ecosystems. So it's very near and dear to our heart, and we partner with our U.S. colleagues on ensuring that we maintain safety for North America and the approaches. So recently, in 2019 of September, this current government released its Arctic and Northern Framework. The jury's out on a lot of people have an opinion on what it is or it isn't. I see it as a strategic visionary document that will enable future Arctic policy development and investment to be nested under that. In 2017, our Minister Sajjan released and pinned with many people in this room, including General Vance, the Canadian Defence Policy, Strong, Secure, and Engage, and it highlighted a lot of Arctic aspirations of things that we want to do and continue to do with our partners and allies. So it maintains, it has been, it is, and it will always be a key priority, I think, for all Canadians.
Well, I think the discussion paper that we read that was submitted as part of this conference by Tom Axworthy suggested that the Canadian policy is really, I can't remember the word he used, but it was, he didn't take it very seriously. And you're talking about it as a visionary document. Can you explain what is visionary about it? How do you...
I say visionary in that the sense it's a chapeau document, in my opinion, and hopefully more solid, more detailed, articulate policy will fall out of that, and it will nest under that. They just appointed a new Minister of Northern Affairs who has just a portfolio for the North. I mean, the reality is, and you had mentioned it, and I think my colleagues would agree on the panel, that the Arctic is a harsh environment. It requires specialized training and certain gear. It's a vast and unforgiving geography. It has limited infrastructure. It has limited and unreliable communications, and it costs a lot of money to work there. So there can be a lot of aspirations, and as hard as you work at changing those into concrete actions, it just doesn't always happen. Mm-hmm. So I think there's a lot of men and women certainly in uniform, and I can speak to that because that's more of my area of expertise, working really hard to ensure we have a presence in the Arctic, and we're doing the right things with our partners and allies.
I was struck by looking at the policy. It talked a lot about a vision for bringing services to the people who live in the Arctic. It talked about education, research, and it also stated an aim to, quote, restore Canada as an Arctic leader. Would you say Canada is an Arctic leader today?
No. I think we're one of the more, of the eight, I'd say we're probably the, in my opinion, can't speak on behalf of the government, but I think we're one of the least developed in the region.
And what would it mean, what would it look like for Canada to be an Arctic leader?
In my opinion, you have to have a constant presence, and that requires infrastructure, that requires having people there, and it requires having different services, and just the basics of what they're talking about for the people who live there. So it's a huge investment, and with investment is competing priorities of how you're going to do that. So I think it's a more concentrated presence in the region.
And Mr. Eide, from the Norwegian perspective, how do you see the big picture on the Arctic?
So I was here at the very first Halifax Security Forum talking about the Arctic, so there's a certain déjà vu. And back then, we, Norway, and the government of Jens Stoltenberg that I served in as a minister, we were trying to raise the attention of our allies that something important was going on. And the argument is and was that the Arctic is an ocean. It's the opposite of Antarctica, not only because it's on the opposite side, but also because Antarctica is a landmass with ice on it, and the Arctic is an ocean with countries around it. And it used to be frozen, and hence its military meaning was first and foremost that it was the shortest flying route for planes and missiles over between Soviet Union and the US, but and you can hide your submarines there. But otherwise, there wasn't much attention, apart from that, in the very sort of high strategic picture. Now the ice is melting, which is bad news. It's because of climate change. But the consequence of the melting ice is that it becomes more like a normal ocean, and it's an ocean that connects, again, Russia to North America and Europe to Asia, because this will be a future sailing and transport route. And there's also a lot of commercial interest in exploring and exploiting the resources of the region. So what we were arguing then is that our allies need to take some interest in this development. We did not want to sound an alarm bell saying that a war is about to break out, but important things are happening. So the good news is there's more of that attention now. We were at the same time arguing that NATO had developed into an organization that were basically only doing out-of-area operations and non-Article 5. And that's fine, but we also should do a little bit of area and Article 5, and that also has clearly changed. And I was very happy to see Trident Juncture, this largest exercise for decades happening in my home country, Norway. I think that's the direct consequence of that change in NATO. What I also want to say is that the good news is that this is not the South China Sea. There is actually no significant dispute over the legal order, because every single state has either signed UNCLOS, the Law of the Seas Convention, or they haven't signed as the United States, but they have declared that they will abide by all its obligations. I mean, it beats me why they're smart, but that's up to the Americans to decide, but still they behave as if. And that means, and this has been confirmed in all Arctic encounters, that we base the cooperation on an existing legal framework, which means that that's something we should take care of. We should maintain that. There's a mutual interest. No country has more interest in this being true than Russia, because half of the Arctic coast is Russian. They will also be worried if everybody else came in and exploited their resources, so we actually happen to have a shared interest with them. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't pay attention to what's going on. We should follow, we should be present, we should have capabilities of being present with ice breakers and ice-prepared vessels and with relevant communications equipment. So this is important, but it's not alarming, is my message. And I think that we should continue to think along those lines, and we can strengthen NATO's recognition that this is area. It's not like we are going to the Arctic, we are there, we live there. I mean, Canadians live there, Alaskans live there, then Danes and Greenlanders live there, we Norwegians live there. It's our area, so it's part of NATO's area, and it always was.
So you said important but not alarming, so I'm going to ask the Secretary to alarm us. What have you seen, either in maritime activity or other activity? You talked about a gray zone of aggression. What are you seeing on the ground that concerns you in terms of threats?
Well, right off the bat, what I first referred to was that while our Russian counterparts are up there lighting up some old, Cold War facilities, more than I would have thought you needed for search and rescue. The Chinese are up there researching, and call themselves a near Arctic participant. I totally agree with Norway in that it's not to the level of alarm per se, but we need to be up there and present to make sure that we're attentive to what's going on, because things could change dramatically in a fairly short period of time.
Well, what do you think China's up to? How do you understand?
Well, I think they're up there probably looking for resources, just like everybody else. The question is, I don't know what they're going to play for a card as far as the ability to participate, but this is why we have to be up there to know what they're doing.
Mm-hmm. General O'Shaughnessy, what do you see as the biggest threat there that concerns you right now?
Well, as the Secretary mentioned, we do see a buildup of Russia and Russian capability. And
what are they building up?
all the way from the infrastructure that the Secretary mentioned and the bases, but also, and perhaps more disturbingly, if you look at that, it might make sense. They have a large percent of their GDP, 20+%, coming from the Arctic, and as such, it would make sense that they would have some capability there. But what we see is an investment in their long-range aviation. We see investment in cruise missiles that far exceed the range that they would necessarily need in a regional conflict. And so we see some potential there that they're trying to use this as an avenue of approach towards North America. So with both my hats of a NORAD commander and a NORTHCOM commander, that causes us concern. And so we want to make sure we have the ability to operate in that environment as well. We need to be able to defend ourselves from that avenue of approach. And whilst we're certainly not trying to militarize it per se, we still have to have the ability to defend our nations.
Mm-hmm. And this reminds me, growing up in Alberta, of being told that Canada was the bologna and the nuclear sandwich between America and the Soviet Union. What are the threats here for Canada that you see evolving, if any?
Well, they're the exact same threats as the U.S. have mentioned, the Secretary and the Commander. I think there's other threats that are evolving that are maybe less hostile in the sense that as the climate changes, there's more shipping, there's more commercial cargo, there's more tourism, there's more research vessels, as the Secretary said, which then requires a more rapid response for search and rescue. And that becomes a threat for us if we're not able to do it in a fast enough time. And I think that's something that's, as more and more people are going into the Arctic and more things are happening, we have to be able to respond to the needs of people. And I can speak firsthand, as when I was the commander of 9-Wing Gander, we were charged with search and rescue in the north, and it's a long ways away. And you're leapfrogging to get there, and you didn't always get there in time. So that becomes a threat in itself, I think, just the amount of people that are going to be there and the activities that are happening, and who's going to be held responsible to respond.
And from a Norwegian perspective, is this just all economic activity resulting from melting waters, and we should all just be relaxed about it, or is there something specific that you find threatening in these activities?
Well, I would distinguish between the Arctic as two different things. So the Arctic as the Arctic is fundamentally about managing economic interest and sea roads and so on, and we should definitely be present and follow also for that reason. But that's the not so alarming thing, but it needs more investment and more presence, because right now Russia is much more present than anybody else, and I would like to have that more balanced. Then on the other hand, of course, because great power competition is back, it also means that the Arctic is a testing ground and principally, in worst comes to show, a firing range for long-distance missiles and so on. That's very worrying, and we can see that at our doorstep, a lot of testing of very advanced new technology, but it's not directed at the Arctic as such. It just happens there. So it's important to distinguish these two things when we talk about the Arctic affairs, but both of them leads to us having to be aware and alert and present and having ability to find out. So my position is that where we can cooperate, we should cooperate. Mm-hmm. You mentioned China. In 2013, we had a vivid discussion at the Arctic Council. I was Foreign Minister then. Secretary Kerry and I and most of us agreed that we should allow for China, together with India, Japan, South Korea, and Singapore, to become observers. At the time, the Harper government was skeptical, and so was Russia. It was an interesting Russia-Canadian alliance against this, but finally we, through good conversation, in an Arctic hut up in northern Sweden, we finally agreed that we should allow. And I think that was a good idea, because basically the argument was that it's better to have these people join our club than to allow them to form another club to our detriment. So by signing these documents and joining the organization as observer, not a member, you also have to sign up to certain rules of the game, and that's something we can remind them of.
And how have you found the Chinese as actors within the Arctic Council in their observer status?
They have taken a keen interest. They have used it to the maximum of the capacity, but they have done it inside the rules of the game.
I think one thing to remember also is everyone thinks that the resource component up there is extraction, such as oil or minerals. We have our protein fields of fish moving farther north all the time. So that is a major resource up there also.
Mm-hmm. And Mr. Eide, you mentioned the idea that NATO should be engaged in the Arctic. It's a question for the whole panel. Does that make sense? The Arctic Council is not about security, as I understand it. It's about managing research and search and rescue. What is Canada's perspective on elevating this to NATO?
Well, I can't speak on behalf of Canada, so I will give you my opinion on what I think it is. But I think it depends on how the threats evolve. So if the threats evolve in a certain way, then it automatically will become a NATO discussion and back on that table, much like it was many years ago. The solution sets that we may need to deter a threat if it continues to evolve and grow, may put it back to NATO. I think the Arctic Council is a great table because it allows peace and cooperation to happen and strategic dialogue to happen separate from what might need to happen from a military perspective in that forum. And it's better to have multiple tools in the toolbox to maintain a situation than just have everything, tied together. So I like having separate solution sets that can come together at one point, but it enables different conversations to happen.
General Shaughnessy.
And we are having this in the NATO conversation. I would just highlight just a couple weeks ago, I was in Norfolk at our NATO Allied Transformation Command doing a symposium there where we were talking about the broader global defenses, of which we included the Arctic in that discussion, and how does NATO fit into that from a command and control standpoint, as well as from a threat standpoint. So I think that dialogue is happening within NATO and will continue to happen as we look forward to really driving forward of what does all these changes in the Arctic really mean.
It's interesting, just to put this into context when we talk about NATO participation up there. When I came back from Reykjavik, I sat down with then CNO John Richardson and was expounding my newfound knowledge about the Arctic, and we have to get up there and the Navy has to get up there, and I was banging the table and he kept looking at me frowning more each time I banged the table. And he said, "Sir, we have been up there since 1968, and I went under the water doesn't count." But that being said, there is more to the Arctic than just on the surface. There is the whole air capacity up there too.
Well, let's talk about that. Let's talk about capabilities. I find that, at least in Canada, the discussion about the Arctic often comes down to a discussion about icebreakers. How many, I read it's 13 icebreakers that Russia has. How many does the US have? How many does Canada have? Give us the lay of the land. Anyone?
Well, we have 1.5. But we've now just laid the hull on our first new series coming out. I say we. Is the Commandant here? Oh, there he is, exactly. It's the Coast Guard's mission. A lot of people turn around to the Navy and go, how come you don't have icebreakers? And I get to point to my fellow brethren here because there's no light between us, but you have the icebreaking mission. First one's being laid and 5 more to come after that. I thought I had 6.
So we're talking about a strategy to get to 6. We awarded the contract in April for the first, and hopefully 3 large Polish security and figure out the way forward.
It's got a real-time briefing here. This is great. Talk a little bit more about capabilities. What capabilities do you have? What do you think you need and should have?
Right, so clearly the icebreaker and our teamwork with the Coast Guard, my good friend Carl, we continue to work that and we advocate for that certainly as well. But additionally, from a capability standpoint, I think we just start with awareness. We have to be aware of what is happening in that environment.
So is that satellites? What does that mean?
I think it's everything, and that's traditionally, and you look back to some great binational work that was done between Canada and the U.S. with the DEW line, the distant early warning line that was created when a contract in January of 1955, completed nominally in 57, and actually it ultimately grew to be a line all the way from Midway Island to Scotland of this early warning capability. Back in the mid-'80s, 85 or so, again, a binational work after the Shamrock Summit, where we were able to have a renewed investment into that early warning between Canada and the U.S. of having that domain awareness, understanding what's happening within our own territories, was reinvigorated with the North Warning System. And so I think these kinds of things of having that awareness is something we have to look to invest in, again, as the future between the U.S. and Canada together binational. I think we can get after that. And then I think it's important to note, we send people, all our militaries do, all over the world, and very quickly can deploy somewhere and be very effective. That's a different in the Arctic. It's very difficult. You can't just take people and aircraft and ships and ground troops and all the equipment that goes with that and deploy it to the Arctic and expect to be successful if you haven't trained there, if you don't have the right kit, the right gear, because it's such a harsh environment. And so we're really looking at the infrastructure to be able to deploy them, but also the training that would go with that and the right kit and gear that would go with that. And so a revamping, a reinvigorating of the exercise programs, and as the Secretary mentioned, just going there, right? We learn tons just by going there. And we've done this before, so we know how to do this. We just have to get the reps under our belt in order to do that. And then, as Tammy mentioned, simple things become hard. Communication, navigation, very difficult in the Arctic. And so I think we have to look to invest in our ability to do those things where satellite communication of above about 65 degrees starts to drop off. You get above 70, it gets even worse. And then eventually you get very little capability there. We need to invest in the ability to have that communication regardless of where you are in the Arctic. And I think that leads to some of the great innovation that might come down shortly from the commercial world that I think we can take advantage of.
Excuse me. I wanted to add. Sorry. Go ahead.
Thank you, Lisa. Well, I agree, and the communication is one key word. And as you said, the geostationary satellite doesn't reach, so you need to do something about that. There are other, modernary satellites, other things you can do. But I mean, those kind of things is part of the answer, not only the ships. And we don't really invest in icebreakers. We have ice-enhanced vessels, Coast Guard and so on, because our Arctic is actually largely ice-free. And it's important to understand that, for large parts of the year, what used to be frozen is now open. That's why we're having that discussion, because this is now becoming the shortest route. You can save, if you go from Yokohama to Rotterdam there, in the north, you will save like 40% of the sailing route. Now, you can't do that all the year. You don't know exactly when you arrive, which means container traffic is not so interested because they have a just-in-time principle. But bulk traffic, for instance, will increasingly go that route, and somebody has to look after that, and somebody has to be aware of that. So the commercial part of it is also relevant.
From the Canadian perspective, what kind of capabilities do you...
Well, as the minister mentioned yesterday, our Arctic offshore patrol ships are coming online, hopefully. First one last I heard was 2020. The 16 search and rescue aircraft, are set to be delivered. C-295, which will give us strategic reach. It allows us to operate in lower visibility, so that's good. They're working on the fighter project. I was talking to the commander of the Army, I'm not sure where he is, and we were kind of joking. My husband is a Patricia, like the commander of the Army, and they spent most of the first half of their career in the Arctic Circle, jumping out of planes. And the ability just to, as Commander said, just to move across, which we used to do in a BB-206, which are all now rusted out, you have to get new equipment to just drive across the Arctic. So those projects are underway. So it's having the right gear, the right training, and just being able, as the Commander said, to get there, and then once you're there, to move with some amount of access.
I'm curious about the division of labor between Canada and the United States in the Arctic. Can you sort of talk about what you expect from the Canadian military in terms of cooperation or what role it plays and vice versa?
Right, and I think we have great cooperation every day, and I think it's important to note that literally every day as we sit here now too, we have airmen, soldiers, sailors, Marines from the United States and Canada that are protecting our sovereign territory, which includes Canada and the U.S. to include the Arctic aspects of that. And they are ready, on alert right now, able to do that. What we have to do, though, is be able to stay ahead of the threat, right? And so that's going to take some investment in order to do that. And I think the investment that we do, we have an opportunity to do this binationally together, like we have in the past with as I mentioned, the DEW line was a great example, the North Warning System, where we might have a follow-on to that we could do together. I think there might be unilateral things that we could both do that would be complementary to each other there. And then as we go forward, even outside of the NORAD structure, which is binational, but really in the aerospace domain, is we have, against all the other domains, we have the bilateral relationship together. And so I think to me, it's about how do we do this together? We want to be interoperable. We want to make sure that everything we're doing is helping the overall protection of both of our nations. And I think we are looking at an opportunity now going forward to really reinvigorate and renew our efforts with respect to NORAD in particular, to modernize NORAD, to invest in NORAD's capability going into the future.
if I was to look on the Navy side, this is a perfect example where Canada and the U.S. will be no light between us. I was just talking to the Minister of Defense earlier today, and we specifically addressed this because here is a prime example of what I was talking about during my presentation. Expertise. I mean, Canada's been operating in this environment for quite some time. We have not. So we are going to be welded together. I think you'll see whenever we do a movement up here, Canada's going to be right by our side and vice versa.
Are you expecting a lot more movements up here?
As it presents itself, the opportunity presents itself, yes.
So part of what President Trump has been saying to allies, and I have to say I heard President Obama say the same thing, which is we want you to spend more. We want you to build up more in terms of defense resources. Where do you think Canada should be ramping up more in terms of the Arctic?
Canada's doing an absolutely fantastic job. We were just down at the Irving shipyard, and for those of you who drove over the bridge yesterday or the day before, there was hull number 1 in the basin of the Arctic Offshore Patrol Vessel, which is absolutely fantastic, and I gather there's 6 of those coming. I can't remember the numbers, but Canada's, as far as the surface Navy is concerned, we think they're all in.
Can I take us a little bit back to the Arctic Council and political cooperation? Because until recently, we were able to use, at least for the Council as a forum and the topics that were on the Council agenda, to keep sort of geopolitical strife out of it. And that was a deliberate strategy from all of us, not because we didn't see things happening, but that arena should be one to see cooperation. And I have to use this opportunity to say that we were a little worried, to put it carefully, about Secretary Pompeo's speech in Rovaniemi, which was the latest ministerial meeting, where he actually made a big point out of warning against Russia and China now really coming in big time and making a connection between the Arctic and the South China Sea. Well, I think that connection is wrong for the reasons I said initially. This is not an area where I mean, of course, everywhere can turn into a conflict, but there is not an ongoing dispute about anything meaningful. I mean, Canada and Denmark is quarreling about the island of Hans, but I mean, that's not going to start a war. And the US and Canada are discussing the waterways, but they're not going to go to war either. So it's not really an area of serious dispute, and let's keep it that way. So there's something called, speak softly and carry a big stick, and I think that applies well to the Arctic Council.
Just Secretary, do you have any gloss to put on the
That sums it up perfectly.
Well, here's my question.
Pompeo?
Speaking of surprise comments, is the U.S. buying Greenland? Is it for sale? Let's talk about Greenland.
Interestingly enough, I was just over visiting our Norwegian friends for a couple of days, and on the way back, we specifically were going to stop in Greenland. And we had the whole trip lined up with our Danish friends, and we're going to go and see Nuuk, the port down there. And the Arctic did what the Arctic does, and we got weathered out. Is it a place where we can train? Most definitely. Is it a place we'd like to train? Most definitely. And we're going to explore to see if those opportunities exist.
But Senator Tom Cotton wrote a piece arguing, actually, this is a great idea. Let's buy Greenland. Is this seriously being considered? Is this?
It's above my pay grade.
Way beyond.
Well, I would talk to it from the aspect of its strategic real estate that is very helpful already for us. We have, for example, assets in Thule that are fundamental to our ability to defend North America. We have, for example, some of our radar sites, et cetera, operating out of there. And when you really look at it from that aspect with a great partner of Denmark and Greenland, it is really key to, as we go forward, looking at the future of the Arctic, that is absolutely key to that going forward.
How are those comments received in your?
Yeah, so since Denmark isn't here, I'll take some Nordic solidarity here, and not speaking for them, but I can share that there was some surprise in Copenhagen about the idea of buying it. First, because Denmark and Greenland is not for sale.
And build this nice hotel.
But secondly, why would you? Because they're already allies. I mean, working with allies is also a good idea, and I think that. Given that our dear Danish friends have been among the most active in NATO's operations abroad, I think to cancel the visit because they didn't want to sell Greenland was maybe not the best choice that the president has made so far.
Well, I read that China was actually trying to build, I think it was airports or some other kind of installations in Greenland, and that the U.S. was very much lobbying the government against that. So is this going to be an ongoing?
We're following that closely as well.
Yeah. Very interesting. So I wanted to just pull back a little bit and ask, where do you see now, we talked about the South China Sea, there are obviously a lot of things going on in the world. Where is the Arctic as a priority for each of your respective countries in terms of military and strategic priorities? Is it moving up the ranks? How does it rank?
I'll just start with Navy, but I think the general has it as a theater, so he has a different prioritization. But it's moving up in the Navy. Our job is to keep the maritime commons open, international rule and law of the sea. You know what we do as FONOPS, freedom of navigation operations. If in fact that environment opens itself up to surface travel on a regular basis, the Navy has to be there.
And just since we're in Canada, on your point about international navigation, there has been this long-standing difference of opinion about the Northwest Passage being as straits for international navigation in the U.S. point of view and territorial waters in the Canadian point of view. Is that just an agreement to disagree and that nothing's going to happen with that, or
well, like
what's
I said,
the state of play?
We're welded to our Canadian allies and would be together as we transit.
Any Canadian response to that?
No.
Well, in practical terms, I would say we have since 1988 an agreement that's been in place that's allowed us to have differences of opinion and still operate as great allies and partners that we are. So I think it's actually a good testimony to the strength of the relationship between the U.S. and Canada that we're able to work our way through this.
Okay, and I'm about to go to audience questions, so please raise, and we have a lot of audience questions, but just last question from someone here in the room. So this being the Halifax Security Forum, I was sitting on the hotel bus, and the person who sat next to me turned out to be an Arctic expert. So Heather Conley at CSIS, and she raised the concern that the Arctic, as you know, is spread across the various portions of the military, and you are sort of the central voice for it. But she was saying it's not the day-to-day priority for anyone, and she raised the notion that perhaps the org chart is a vulnerability, as she put it, and I wanted just to get your thoughts on that.
I would say it is in my day-to-day agenda, so that is a priority for us, both on the NORAD command and the NORTHCOM command. So it is a priority, and our unified command plan, which on the U.S. side delineates our actual responsibilities, it does designate us as the Arctic advocate. And so because of that, it is on our day-to-day look at what we're prioritizing and how we're doing that. That said, I acknowledge the fact that there are multiple seams with other COCOMs that we continue to work our way through. No matter where you draw a line, there's going to be a seam. And so we make sure that we have the ability to not have that be a limiting factor for us. So I work closely with both Phil Davidson on the PACOM side, with Todd Walters on the UCOM side, to make sure that seam doesn't result in any negative aspect.
I mean, this last summer, in General O'Shaughnessy's theater, we had an amphibious operation on the island of Adak, Alaska. That involved Indo-PACOM, Admiral Davidson. That involved General O'Shaughnessy. While the org chart might have been confusing on paper, the operation really was seamless.
I think we had a question over here. The beautiful lady in the front.
You look beautiful too, Luiza.
No.
Scotty Greenwood, Washington, D.C., Canadian American Business Council. Given the strategic importance of the Arctic, I have a question for all y'all, as we say. There's a place in Canada that is subarctic. It's centrally located. It's on the Hudson Bay, so the Hudson Bay of the Arctic Ocean. And there are old Cold War era military facilities there. It's Churchill, Manitoba, and it's on the. So given that it's difficult to get to the Arctic, given as you all have said the challenges with infrastructure, would it make sense to look at a place like Churchill, which has an airport, and the government of Canada just last year rebuilt a railroad, and it also has a port, not to mention the community that's there and barracks that have been empty since the 1950s. Like, would Churchill, Manitoba, for example, central in the country and in the continent, be considered a strategic location? And would there ever be thought to reinvigorating that place for our strategic capability, given that there is already so much infrastructure there? That's the question. The other little observation is, so we've had a couple of business delegations to Churchill. That's how come I know about it. And for the Commandant of the Coast Guard, we were out looking at beluga whales, and there were some polar bears swimming around last summer, and we had these life suits on the boat. and we had to rescue a boat that had run out of gas, and the beluga whale operator said, "I'm also the Coast Guard," and we said, "Well, what happened? How long do these like if this tips over? There's polar bears in the water. How long do the life suits last?" And he said, "About 5 minutes." And we said, and if you're the Coast Guard, who backs you up if we need help?" And he said, "My 16-year-old daughter." So I think we might need more capability up there.
All right. That's an interesting question. Does this open up opportunities for some of these northern Canadian communities to serve a bigger strategic role?
I think for Churchill, you'd be displacing the polar bear operations of the world up there.
I won't speak specifically to Churchill, but I will say that is something that we are looking at. In fact, we have a north-facing study that we're looking at the infrastructure we have both with the U.S. and Canada, and even outside of that, kind of to the point about going across the COCOM seams, for example, into Greenland, et cetera, and looking at, are we properly postured? Do we have the right infrastructure? Will we be able to increase our activity there? So these are the types of things that we're looking for, and clearly the logistics aspect of that plays a critical role.
I know that Senator Sullivan and Murkowski are really making us focus, rightly so, on do we need a strategic Arctic port, and we've been looking around up there. And Canada is now in the process of lighting up a strategic port.
And one question that came up on Twitter earlier today I wanted to pose to you is what is the role of the Indigenous people in Canada as this becomes a bigger and bigger priority?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, they already play certainly a strong role in search and rescue and just advising if they see something and what goes on. They provide the first line of defense, I would say, because they're on the ground. And I would defer that to General Vance, who's sitting in the front, if he has, since I've left, done more with Indigenous people or people in the north.
Would you like to comment? Can we get a microphone down here, please?
Yeah, thanks, Tammy.
No problem, sir. It's great to retire. You can pass the question.
Delegate up. Yeah, that's right. The northern basing infrastructure and the architecture of the defense of the approaches to Canada is going to have us look again at where we need to be with what. And the great advantage of the northern peoples, the Indigenous community, is not only are they part of the social fabric of the nation, they're also a potential workforce and on the ground and everywhere we need them. So it's not always a question of the South reinforcing the North, it's enabling the North to be a part of that fabric, whether it be a defense or any other part. So vital. And there are Canadians that need to be protected and defended, and we'll demand that too. So all the services. So they're a vital part of the whole thing.
And if I might add to that as well, you might be surprised actually how much we work with what we consider partners in the Indigenous people, and I look at it from both lenses. One, on the Northcom side and the NORAD side in Alaska, we work very closely with the Alaska Federation of Natives, in fact Julie Kika, the president, and I often work at different symposiums together. And one of the things that we find is we actually have common challenges. And so now we're looking for what are the common solutions to our common challenges. An example of that is communication. If we could break through and innovate in our ability to communicate, that would be incredibly important for some of those remote villages. As an example, we had just 2 weeks ago, we had a symposium at Fairbanks, Alaska, where we had not only the Alaska Federation of Natives there, but we also had the Canadian Rangers and that program that we have here in Canada. That is a great model that we're trying to see what can we do with that in Alaska, as an example, where we can take full advantage of the 10,000 years of experience they have within working within the Arctic that we can then bring to bear on what we need. So I think a great partnership already exists, but I think even more can be done with us and both in U.S. and Canada.
I just also want to say that Indigenous people, in our case, the Sami community, is an important part of our Arctic policies in Norway, but also in the northern Russia, northwestern Russia, we have the Sami people living there, and the Arctic cooperation and what we call the Barents cooperation has actually also helped empowering them in Russia, because this has become a theme in Arctic conversations. So they've kind of also got an arena, international arena, that they didn't have before, which I think is also an important dimension of the more sort of softer type of cooperation across the border.
And how do you give them a voice in your northern policy in Norway?
Yeah, well, indeed, they have definitely have
formal.
A voice. They would probably like to have even more, but they are formally involved by all means.
A question right here in the front row, please.
Paula Dobriansky, Harvard University, but relevant to this conversation, I was an Undersecretary of State and had the responsibility in my portfolio of attending Arctic Council meetings, and I attended 3 of them. But the one that I remember especially, and just a brief comment, is the one that was chaired by Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov, and it occurred in Siberia in Salakard. And the comment is, because you asked about threats, I have to say Russia attaches a great priority to the Arctic, and it's even stated very directly by the Russian foreign minister in his writings and his statements. And so with the building of the base in Trefoil and the investments that both of you have mentioned, it's very significant, and that Norway has particularly flagged. But my first question is, you mentioned Stoltenberg. Stoltenberg was here 2 years ago, and he used the platform, in fact, of Halifax to highlight a number of issues and a number of threats, and he highlighted and previewed the new command, the Atlantic Command, which was then endorsed by NATO and put into Norfolk. So the first question is, what beyond that? There's been some conversation within NATO of going beyond the Atlantic Command and really devoting singularly a command structure in NATO to the Arctic. I'd want your reaction on that. And then the second one is, from having had also the benefit of going several times to the Arctic, to Svalbard, the northernmost human settlement of Norway, India, China, and Russia all have research facilities. The United States, we decided not to do that. Is that something that's part of the calculation in this regard, given the comments about what assets we put in and what our investments are?
Go ahead.
I'll start it out just with Second Fleet, which is our asset contribution foundation for the NATO structure, a joint structure, which, as you know, when the wall fell and history stopped, we hung up the Second Fleet. Well, it's back in full operation now. And that's the U.S.'s contribution to that. But as far as NATO actually making a full Arctic command, I am not aware of it, only because I'm not involved in that right now. Research is a great question. And if you look at ONR, the Office of Naval Research, we're actually discussing that right now as to what is up there. But you can't go up there just for the sake of saying research. As you know, you have to have a plan for what you want to research. Priming the pump.
Interesting. Go ahead.
So back in the Cold War, NATO had regional command centers with regional responsibilities, and they knew what was where. Then after the Cold War, we had a long period where, believe it or not, it's almost incredible to think about it, but we didn't have that, because any NATO command was either doing transformation or it was doing some kind of desert operation in a faraway place. So we didn't have these geographical responsibilities. That has been brought back. Partly thanks to the initiative that we were part of as Norway. I'm very happy for that. I'm glad for what happened with Norfolk. And of course, we also have the national commands, which are part of NATO as well. So our northern core command center in Reitan outside of Bodø is also there for NATO. So it's not only about what you call the combined centers, but also the national presence that we all have.
Gentleman in the second row.
General O'Shaughnessy, Dov Zakheim, used to be Undersecretary of Defense. But General O'Shaughnessy, you mentioned the Shamrock deal. I negotiated that. We had it done by noon because the President and Mulrooney had to sign it a couple of hours later. So my question to you, actually, is where does the upgrade of the North Warning System now stand? And having been in charge of the money in the Pentagon, do you have the money for it?
Right. Well, one, thank you for negotiating that between President Reagan and Prime Minister Mulroney. That system has really been critical to us going forward. And in fact, we are looking at what is the next step for that, and what is the modernization of that. We have an analysis alternative that's actually a binational study being done right now that is determining what is the best way forward. My sense is that there will be not only a reinvestment in the North Warning System type approach, but also bigger than that, right? Because we have to go beyond just having terrestrial-based radars for our awareness, and really the proliferation of LEO, the other added capability and technology that we now have is what we're looking for from analysis of alternatives. So yes, it is being looked at. The study is funded, and we're looking at what is the output of that study shortly to see what is the way ahead that then will work binationally in the broader structure.
The gentleman right there by the camera, in the second row.
Yeah, Ataje Kamiya, Professor of International Relations at National Defense Academy of Japan. Two military leaders of the United States emphasized that the importance of extending existing liberal rules-based international order to the Arctic region. And they emphasized that, importance of the alliance cooperation to achieve that goal. But mainly, the discussion has been focused on the Atlantic region. How about in Asia? Japan is the major US ally in Asia, but it's non-Arctic country. What kind of role does the United States expect or wants to see from Japan? I would like to answer this question from Mr. Secretary.
Yes, definitely. No. So this summer when we had our Arctic exercise up there, that was the first time we've gone up in quite some time. Next time we go up with our allies. Japan will be invited to come right along with us. A participant as a surface combatant, where we could actually train together, integrate together, and war game together.
Can you take us to that exercise? I'd love to hear more about it. What did you learn? I heard you got, the seas were a little rough.
Well, that was over in Trident Juncture, yeah, which I talked about there. The seas were a little rough, but I'll tell you about what happened on the Pacific side. Was the Arctic does what it does so well. We learned a lot. We had helicopters on the back of one of our ships, and we found out that we had to slow down considerably because the helicopter there was no hangar space for the helicopter, so we had to travel at the max limits of what the wind speeds were for the helicopter. We learned from that. Weather came in, and it was aborted for 3 days. I mean, we really learned that, like Mike Tyson says, a plan's really great till you get punched in the face. We got punched in the face a couple of times, but that's what the Arctic is about. It's about a very austere and unforgiving climate.
A question right here, Senator.
If I could ask, I think you said you thought these issues were important but not alarming, and then the moderator said, Mr. Secretary, alarm us. And you went down the line, and I noticed that none of you in your alarm said the actual melting of ice and the rising of the sea level and the melting of the permafrost. None of you said that was your principal alarm. You focused on what countries are doing. Have you all just sort of planned that that's just kind of baked in and there's nothing we can do about it? And is that why it didn't jump to mind as an alarm? What is the consensus planning about, 10, 20, 50 years, and then the challenges that presents?
Go ahead.
Very good question, and thanks for asking. I was hoping to get there. The melting of the ice and the climate change is a very deep global concern. It's actually my #1 concern these days, and it's going to grow in our collective concern. And we can see that in the Arctic, because over 2 degrees warming of the globe means maybe 8 to 10 degrees warming of the high north and the deep south, because of the nature of these things. So we can see that very close hands. And one particular effect, and you mentioned the permafrost. People talk about the melting of the ice, but the breaking up of the permafrost is very relevant for northern Russia, because they're already seeing that infrastructure that is built on what was believed to be fixed land is now literally breaking. Entire small towns are breaking apart, roads are breaking apart, which forces more of the domestic traffic to go out to the sea, the Arctic Sea, simply because there you can sail because the ice is gone. So it's a major change for Russia. It will probably come to Canada and all of us eventually, but this is already very noticeable, and we have to understand that this is part of Russia's concern as well, on the massive changes going on geophysical in their neighborhood because of climate change. So it's a big deal. And there's also the ice is melting, but also moving. So there are parts of the Arctic where there will be more ice, even if the total amount goes down. So it's sort of because of current and several things which I can't explain, but other people can. But you have a significant also movement of ice. And as the Secretary mentioned, fish will move. Fish prefers colder water, I mean cod and so on. So they will move away from where they used to be, to the detriment of the fishermen who's there, and then they will appear elsewhere. And that can also create new questions and new tensions, of course.
I know in the Canadian North, there's already a lot of climate change impacts. Do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, there is. I mean, I was going to ask you if my 3 daughters had called to tell you to yell at me about the environment in the Arctic, because we have this conversation at my house quite often. We note that permafrost is melting, the ice is melting, the air is getting warmer, precipitation patterns are changing, harmful UVB radiation is increasing exponentially. When the permafrost, thaws, gases come out, that causes more methane, more issues in the thing. NASA has said that, we've lost, the polar ice caps are melting actually at 9% every decade. So if you look at it that way, we've lost 40% of the Arctic ice is thickness since 1960, and 95% of the oldest documented ice is gone. 99% of our fresh water supply is in the Arctic and the Antarctica. When I look at the climate change piece, sir, I kind of look at it, it's a whole of government, to try to figure out how we're going to stop that. And more than that, it's every nation in this room to figure out what are we going to do to stop what's happening in the Arctic. It's just not as simple. When we talk about it being complex, it affects the rest of the world, and it's a huge Herculean effort, I think, to stop what we've put in place, what's happening now.
Just a very quick comment on it, just to be clear. The ice that is already in water, when it melts, it doesn't raise the water level because it is water. So the ice you should be worried about for sea rise is the Greenland ice and the Antarctic ice and the Himalaya ice, and it will happen, so we have a problem. But it's not the floating ice, because that just converts to another form of water. It's still a problem, but it's a different problem.
So we talk a whole of globe, and I'd be remiss if I didn't bring this up, but we talk about China, to be very frank with you, which benefits from its stature as a major country without the responsibility. If you picked up this Friday's Financial Times, you saw that China is going to light up as many coal generation facilities that will negate all the positive carbon remediation that we've done on the globe. That is not a responsible member of the community. And they signed the Paris Accord. Go square that with me. The video doesn't match the audio.
Well, I think it's also interesting that they are moving so rapidly and much more rapidly than everyone else towards electrification. And just having talked to the head of the NRDC in China, saying in the last 5 years, the steps they've taken, few people are aware of, but on reducing the reliance on coal is ahead of where they thought they'd be. So I think it's a complicated question, but
saying one thing, doing another.
No, actually, I mean, there's a lot to be said about China, and we're saying it here. But on this front, I actually happened to come from China yesterday discussing exactly these things. There is a massive focus now on electrification of everything. And there's more, and this is real facts, there's more newly installed electrical power from clean energy in China alone than the rest of the world combined over the last couple of years. And there's a massive plan for a green change in China. The problem is that China's growth has been so fast. So they're both the worst in class and best in class at the same time. Emissions go up because they continue to grow, but there is also a strategy to do something about it. So I am less worried about this particular facet of China after spending a week there talking about these issues. I saw the article, but it doesn't really fit with my impression. And I also say that for the first time in many years, I saw a blue sky over Beijing. It used to be gray. Something's happening.
Question right there.
Thanks so much. Liz Economy from the Council on Foreign Relations. So actually on this point,
I loved your book.
Oh, thank you. I would say that that CO2 emissions in China have increased each of the past 3 years, actually. And it's not just about what China's doing inside the country, but they are exporting over 100 coal-fired power plants through their Belt and Road project. So I tend to align myself with Mr. Oh, I just forgot your name. So anyhow, here's my
Secretary Spencer, who's not resigning.
Thank you. Yes. Thank you. Okay. My comment on the Arctic is I understand the rationale for bringing China into granting it observer status. But I think that's not where China is going to stop. And if you think about this in the context of Xi Jinping's call for China to lead in the reform of global governance, I think you can look at its comments about climate change, for example, and that what's taking place in the Arctic with regard to climate change means that it cannot be managed by the Arctic Council members themselves, right? So with resources and climate change, they're going to need to broaden the group that is addressing Arctic-related issues. So I think this is a first step, just as a call-out, a first step toward China trying to increase its role in the sort of decision-making elements of the Arctic. But my question is, somebody raised the point about the polar belt and road, and what we've seen is that there's been a move from the economic elements of the Belt and Road to security elements, right? With the ports, with airports, et cetera. I'm wondering whether you see the potential for that happening in the Arctic, that as China's economic role grows, which it is, that it will begin to say things like, we need to have our military present in order to protect our resources and our people.
Great question. Does one follow the other?
Yeah, well, I'll take a shot at that. I'll start out with the Shuilong is a Chinese research vessel that has been repeatedly going into the Arctic, and we see that as the probable precursor to additional Chinese military operations within that. So yes, we do see potential for Chinese military activity there, and obviously we are concerned with that and would want to be able to respond.
And I think the whole dynamic does change as the ice departs, because then if it becomes a maritime commons, the Arctic Council takes a whole different taxonomy.
And do you think, Mr. Eide, because you were talking about the Arctic Council, is China satisfied now with its observer status, or do you expect to see them want to get an actual seat at the table, or other countries who might want to join?
Well, I mean, those who form the council will decide, and I don't think we're going to offer seats to any country that isn't an Arctic country. I mean, that's part of the logic of that council. But I agree. I mean, China will take a broader interest by all means. That's absolutely clear. But there's a difference, again, between the Arctic and other areas where China engages. I mean, there's a limited number of countries in the Arctic. Russia. I don't think they will sell ports to China, but if they do, we can't do much about it, but I doubt it. I don't think Canada and the US will. We will definitely not. And there has been, as we know, there's been questions about it in Greenland and Iceland, at least previously, that we're watching. But it's not like, there's not like a bunch of weak, failing states with high depth up there. That's not, so let's remember it's a different area. You simply can't do what China is doing in many other parts because those countries don't exist. If we agree that Russia is at least a well-organized state, even if it's not organized as we would want it, it means it's all the Arctic states are reasonably centrally controlled, organized states that can make decisions. That's a big difference, and I think it matters in this context when we make that comparison with being the Belt and Road, because that's, to put it carefully, not the case for the whole of the Stans and the South Asia and so on.
Well, thank you all. I'm sorry we've run out of time, but this has been wonderful, and I think we've learned a lot, and we've learned that we're not quite alarmed yet, but this is an issue that's rising, I think, up the priority list. Obviously, we can expect a lot more investment in capabilities, in research, and a lot more discussion on these topics, and a lot more rethinking of what is the role here for cooperation versus a competition.
Deal with it early, and we avoid the alarm, right?
Excellent.
That's right.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.